was rather substantial, because now he has a lovely home at Point Clear, Alabama, overlooking Mobile Bay, and he can pursue his passion, which happens to be history. Winston Groom was also the featured author for the Tupelo Reads program a couple of years ago, and I'm sure some of you came to hear him. A lot of people that came to that program did not read Forrest Gump, but they were history buffs, and they had read some of his other books. He's written 20 books in all, some nonfiction, some fiction, but mostly nonfiction, and most of from a historical perspective. One of those is Shiloh, about the battle in the Civil War. Another's about the siege of Vicksburg. He wrote about the aviators, and now, of course, he has written about the three generals. Winston Groom grew up in Mobile, Alabama. He went to the University Military School, and he also went to the University of Alabama. While he was at the University of Alabama, he was the editor of a literary magazine. And when he took that position, he decided that he would become a writer. And when he graduated in 1965, that's what he wanted to do. But of course, the Vietnam War was on. So Winston Groom went to Vietnam, where he earned the rank of captain. And he was there from 1966 to 1967. The Vietnam War had a profound effect on Winston Groom and his life and in his writing. He came home from Vietnam. He was a reporter with Washington Star, and it was there that he was befriended by Mississippi's good old boy, Willie Morris. Willie Morris encouraged him to write, and he went to New York and became part of that literary crowd there. But like all good old boys, like Willie Morris did, he came home, and he went home to Alabama, and he came home to write, and that's what he's been doing ever since. But let's get to the generals. The one thing these generals have in common, Winston Groom tells us, is that they are descendants of the first families of Virginia. Now, Winston Groom says the first families of Virginia are America's only true aristocracy. Now, the ladies in the DAR, whose ancestors came over on the Mayflower, may beg to differ, but I concur with Winston Groom. Those people from Virginia are truly aristocratic. The other thing they have in common is all three of these generals, from the time they were boys, wanted to pursue a career in the military. They had ancestors who had been military heroes, and they wanted to follow in their footsteps. And all three wanted to go to the United States Military Academy at West Point, and they all tried to get in. Well, let's go to the generals. Let's start with George Marshall. George Marshall was born December the 31st, 1880. He was a descendant of a prominent Virginia family. One of his ancestors was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States, and there are a lot of Revolutionary War heroes and Civil War heroes. George Marshall's family was from Virginia, but his grandfather eventually migrated to Kentucky. His grandfather and his uncles fought in the Civil War, and as was true of most border states, both of his uncles and his father fought for both sides. Brother actually fought against brother. So he had family members who had fought for the Union and family members who had fought for the Confederacy. So this was a turbulent time within his family and in the state of Kentucky. His mother and father eventually migrated to Uniontown, Pennsylvania. And Winston Groom says he had an idyllic childhood growing up there. And I can't imagine that because I've been to Uniontown, Pennsylvania, and it's not very idyllic now, but I'm sure it was when he was growing up. Marshall, of course, wanted to pursue a military career, and his dream was to go to West Point. But as it turns out, he lived in Pennsylvania. The congressman there was a Republican. George Marshall's father was a staunch Democrat, and so George Marshall did not get the appointment. The next best choice for George Marshall was to go to Virginia Military Institute, and so he made application to attend VMI, which is in Lexington, Virginia. I don't know if you've ever been there, but it's a beautiful campus and right next to Washington and Lee. All of George Marshall's family members had been to VMI, and at the time of his application, his brother was a cadet at VMI. Now, there was an incident when he was making this application that he surreptitiously overheard between his mother and his brother, who was the cadet at VMI. And his brother was concerned about George going to VMI because he was afraid that he would sully the prominent Marshall name. And George Marshall, who had been a mediocre student at that time, said nothing changed him more in his life than overhearing that conversation. And he determined that he would never be mediocre again, and he would excel at everything he tried to do. And he did excel. He went to VMI, and Winston Groom says it is inexplicable, but George Marshall did not seem to mind the hazing or the strict discipline. He seemed to almost thrive on it. And as it turns out, George Marshall was named first cadet at VMI, which is the highest honor you can have. Also, while he was at VMI, he fell in love with a young lady named Lily. It turns out that Lily's home was right outside the gates of VMI. She was an accomplished pianist, and he would hear this lovely music wafting out the windows. She was a pretty girl, and anyway, they were secretly engaged, fell in love, and they were married shortly after he graduated from VMI. After his graduation, he sought a commission in the U.S. Army, and he and Lily went to these remote outposts in the Wild West. And even though she was in fragile health and a musician, she was quite a trooper. All of these wives of these generals to me are just as amazing as their husband. One interesting tidbit: in 1910, George Marshall and his wife Lily took a grand tour of Europe, of course on a shoestring, and they were gone for 4 months. And they had a wonderful time, but this was the end of the Belle Epoque period in Europe, or the Gilded Age. And George Marshall said, in 1914, it all blew up. The lights went out, and it never was the same again. So I think that was, he saw Europe before the Great War, the First World War. Well, let's go to George Patton and his beginnings. George Smith Patton Jr. was born November the 11th, 1885. That must have been providential because November the 11th is Armistice Day. But he was born in Lake Vineyard, California, on his family's 1300 estate, where they had a vineyard and they had a citrus grove, and they were very well-to-do. But as it turns out, George Patton's family was from a long line of illustrious Virginians, and they were diehard Confederates. His great-grandfather had settled in Virginia in the 1700s. He came after the Battle of Culloden and the disbursements of the Klan. They were all very prominent, had many positions in Virginia. As it turns out, Patton's grandfather fought for the Confederacy during the Civil War. And he was killed when his son, when Pat's father was 8 years old, at the Battle of Winchester. He was a brigadier general in the Confederacy. Patton's grandmother, one of the most interesting characters in the book, Susan Glasswell Patton, was left a widow. Virginia at that time was completely devastated. Richmond had been burned. It was completely in ruins. All of Virginia was just destitute. And she was a widow with 4 children. So she moved in with her father. She moved to his plantation in Virginia, and he was blind. She moved in with him to take care of him and to take care of her brother, who had contracted tuberculosis when he was a prisoner of war in a Union camp in New York. So she was a young widow, and she had all of these responsibilities, and they were impoverished. As it turns out, she had a brother who had migrated to California before the Civil War. He sent her a letter inviting her to bring them all to join them in California. And he sent her money for passage to California. Susan Glasswell Patton sold everything they had except for her husband's saddle, his bridle, his sword, and his gold watch. She took her 4 children, she took her blind father and her tuberculous brother who was dying. They boarded a steamer, made it all the way to Panama. There was no Panama Canal. They hiked across the Isthmus of Panama, and then they boarded another steamer. They made it all the way to California. Can you imagine? She was an intrepid soul. I can't, and now you understand why George Patton was such a brave soldier. His grandmother did this all by herself with all of these responsibilities. So they got to California. The Pattons were welcomed with open arms, and I think they made the right decision because they all flourished there. But General Patton says they were always diehard Confederates, and he said every evening when he would say his prayers, he would kneel beside his bed and he would look up at the etchings above the bed, and he said one etching was of God and the other one was of Jesus. And he said he didn't realize until he was almost a grown man that the etchings were of Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson. George Patton's grandmother remarried, and she married Colonel George Hugh Smith. And his story is interesting too. Mike told me not to talk too much about that. But anyway, he had been in love with Susan Glasswell all of his life. He was a classmate of her husband's at VMI. After the Civil War, he refused to take the loyalty oath, and he fled to Mexico. Eventually, he ended up in California, and he married Susan Glasswell. And he adored her children and took them in. And as I said, she made the right move, even though it took a lot of courage. The Pattons' early tutor, the children were tutored. They didn't go to school at first. They were tutored by their Aunt Nanny, who was the great influence in George Patton's life. And she, of course, introduced them to the classics. They read Sir Walter Scott, they read the Shakespeare, etc., and they took it all in. But she was the first to notice that George Patton had a little trouble learning, reading, and spelling, even though she recognized his brilliance. And of course today he would be diagnosed as being dyslexic. But anyway, she was still a very good tutor and very much an influence in his life. As it turned out, George Patton went to, at 11, he was sent to the classical school for boys in Pasadena. And this school had an emphasis on history and the classics. But of course, George Patton loved history. And he says this was one of the greatest influences on his life. I have to tell you that George Patton was a pretty little boy. He had blonde curls. I know it's hard to envision that. And they called him Georgie. So the family always called him Georgie, even though he was quite a military hero. Well, George Patton wanted to follow in the steps of his ancestors. He really wanted to go to West Point, but he had the same problem George Marshall had. He could not get the appointment, and then academically he was going to have a little trouble, passing the entrance exam. So, like George Marshall, he went to VMI, and all of the Pattons that in his family before they got to California went to VMI. And at VMI, George Patton happened to excel. And he did extremely, extremely well there. But he never gave up on his dream to go to West Point. So he applied to West Point, and he got in West Point, and he did rather well, but he flunked, I think, 2 courses, which meant he flunked out. But they gave him the opportunity to start over again. George Patton was determined. He went back, went through all of the hazing, all of that plebe year again, just to be at West Point. But this time, George Patton, like George Marshall, determined that he would succeed. And George Patton had this remarkable memory, prodigious memory. So he used his memory skills, and George Patton worked harder than anyone, and he ended up graduating in the top third of his class. After graduation, George Patton received a commission in the Army, and he also married a distant cousin of his, Beatrice Ayers. George Patton was very smart in that he married a very, very wealthy woman from Boston. And she was quite a character too. This is jumping ahead a little bit, but Beatrice, they called her B, was very wealthy, had been a debutante and very refined and everything, but she was feisty, a lot like George Patton. One time she overheard another soldier criticizing her Georgie, and the next thing that officer knew, he was on the ground and Beatrice was pummeling him because they had to pull Beatrice off of this. So I don't think that officer did that again. George Patton and George Marshall and MacArthur were all sent to the Wild West, and they all helped to catch Pancho Villa and his villains who were terrorizing the citizens in the Southwest and the west of the United States. So that was before World War I. Well, let's go to MacArthur. Douglas MacArthur was born January the 26th, 1880, at Fort Dodge, Arkansas. MacArthur's father was a captain in the regular army. His family was from Massachusetts, and he fought for the Union. And his father was a hero at Chattanooga in the Battle of Missionary Ridge. And for his heroic efforts there, he received the Medal of Honor. After the Civil War, MacArthur's father was sent to New Orleans as part of the Army during Reconstruction. And he was there when Beast Butler was there, the nefarious Beast Butler who terrorized the people of New Orleans. But as it turns out, this lovely, beautiful lady from Virginia, one of the first families of Virginia, went to New Orleans to visit relatives. She met this handsome soldier, and eventually they were married. And she was like Bee and like Lily. When they were sent to these outposts, she was a real trooper. Douglas MacArthur sort of grew up in the Wild West, but when they were stationed in El Paso, he went to the Texas Military Academy, and like George Patton, he excelled in the classics. These schools emphasize history and the classics, and they're very rigorous academically, but But Douglas MacArthur said this made a great impact on his life and really made a difference in his life. And of course, of all of these, Douglas MacArthur may have been the most academically inclined or brilliant. I hate to say that, but anyway. Douglas MacArthur wanted to go to West Point. That was his dream. He wanted to follow in the footsteps of his father and his ancestors, and that is exactly what he did. But unlike Patton and Marshall, MacArthur didn't have any trouble getting into West Point. MacArthur took the test, he studied for it a while, and of course he had the highest score of all of the applicants who took the test. And when he went to West Point, he graduated #1 in his class. So he is very eloquent too, one of my favorites. Well, let's go to World War I. In 2014, Archduke Ferdinand and his wife were assassinated, if you remember your history, by a 19-year-old Serb. The Austrians thought the Serbs were behind it, and of course, a war ensued in Europe. The United States at that time was very much an isolationist nation. They did not want to get involved in a war in Europe. But however, the Germans made the mistake of sinking the Lusitania, if you remember that from your history, and there were several Americans who lost their lives on the Lusitania. And then in 1917, Germany resumed the unrestricted sinking of ships in British waters. And this, of course, brought the United States into the conflict. They really had no choice then. And it brought them into the conflict with 5 million men. And this is hard to fathom. But in that war, 32 nations were involved in World War I, and it was such a tragic event. Well, before I begin that, all of these generals, they were prepared. Patton and Marshall and MacArthur, they were prepared for this world war. This is what they had been trained for. In 1917, Marshall sailed to France with the 1st Infantry Division. Patton went as an aide-de-camp to General Jack Pershing. And Patton had it was here that Patton had another out-of-body experience. Well, I forgot to tell you about the out-of-body experience he had when he went to Europe with his wife. They'd gone to Brittany and Normandy in France, and there they saw the hedgerows, etc., as they toured Brittany and Normandy. And Patton told me then, he said, I have fought here before as a Roman soldier 2,000 years ago. And then when he went back in 1917, well, this is why George is so interesting. When he went back in 1917 as an aide-de-camp to Pershing, he was ordered to find a route for Pershing to go visit the battlefield in Flanders. So he had a driver, and he and the driver took off, and he asked the driver if the camp was right over there to his left or right, you know, and the driver said no, but that was the site of a battle that the Romans had fought 2,000 years earlier. And then when they were returning, George Patton asked the driver, he said, well, now the theater of operation is right over there. And he said, well, not really, it's close, but that's the site of the Roman theater when the Romans were here, and they had invaded Gaul. And of course, George Patton told him he had been there before and fought there before. So, anyway, he was a clairvoyant. MacArthur was sent to France and with the 42nd Infantry Division, and he suggested they call up units from as many states as possible so that a division would stretch across the country like a rainbow. Most of the people he commanded were from National Guard units, and this became the famous Rainbow Division of World War I and World War II. And actually, MacArthur said he commanded a bunch of Alabama cotton growers and Iowa pig farmers. but they all loved MacArthur. It was also in World War I that George Marshall had an argument with a French general, and he took it up with Pershing, and this was a very courageous thing to do because you really don't do that in the Army. You can lose your rank easily. But Marshall's genius became evident during World War II, and he became indispensable to Pershing and the other commanders in that area. And if George Marshall thought something was right, he would defend it. And he also would have the facts and the information to back up his position. So he showed his genius early in World War I. MacArthur became legendary MacArthur was a little flamboyant. He became legendary for his unorthodox uniform during World War I. He did not wear a helmet, the double-way helmet. He did not wear that. He would wear sort of a rakish cap, and he was very handsome. And then also, he would wear a long scarf knitted by his mother, Pinky. And I haven't told you this yet, but Douglas MacArthur was sort of a mama's boy. When he went to West Point, his mother went with him. And that's probably why he did so well. And then anyway, he was very close to his mother. But she knitted this scarf, and he was proud to wear it. And also, he refused to carry a pistol, and he took to carrying a riding crop. Of course, he didn't ride a horse. I don't know what he was going to do with that. But anyway, he was very, very instrumental. MacArthur was a hero in World War I. He received 5 Silver Stars, the Croix de Guerre, and he received the French Legion of Honor. So, and his men loved him. He had sort of an imperious demeanor, but his men loved him. Between the wars, this is, generals don't do well when they don't have a war, but anyway, this is an interesting time also. After World War I, George Marshall went with Pershing on all of the victory tours. He marched down the Champs-Élysées in Paris for that grand celebration, and then he went on to London and other places in Europe. And then Patton came home, and because he was so wealthy, he and V mixed with high society. They had polo ponies, and George Patton was an accomplished equestrian, and he could play polo, and they rode to the hounds, and they were really part of the swing set in Washington, D.C. at that time. But he also found out that his beloved tank corps that he had established in France was put in mothballs, and he was very discouraged by that, and he was a little frustrated. MacArthur came home to no welcoming parades. The Rainbow Division had voted against it, and when MacArthur came home, he was appointed superintendent of West Point. He was just 39 years old, and in June 1919, he moved into the mansion at West Point with his mother, Pinky. But anyway, at West Point, he tried to change the curriculum. He felt the emphasis should be less on math and more on the humanities. Of course, this is what he loved. And he also introduced the honor system at West Point. And MacArthur tried to do away with hazing at West Point because he had been the victim of a very sadistic cadet who hazing almost did him in. So that would have been a great loss for us. It was also while he was at West Point that MacArthur married for the first time, and he married a lady, a divorcee, and Pinky did not like her. She felt the attraction was purely physical. But anyway, Pinky was right. The marriage did not last, but anyway, it was very interesting. During the war, Marshall was sent to China, And upon his return, his wife Lily died, but eventually he did remarry a widow with 3 children, and he simply adored those 3 children. Marshall was such a decent, fine man. Both Marshall and Patton spent this time between wars a lot of time in Hawaii. One interesting facet of this is that when Patton was sent to Hawaii to serve there at Fort DeRussy, he decided he would sail. He was an accomplished sailor, and B said, well, if you're going to sail to Hawaii from San Francisco, I'm going with you. So they bought a sailboat, the Arcticus. They knew nothing about navigating in the oceans. They're good sailors, but just off the coast of Catalina. So they eventually ended up with a crew of 6, and they sailed almost 2,000 miles to Honolulu, and they survived that voyage. So this shows you how brave they both were, both George Patton and his wife. When they got to Honolulu, they were met with hula girls and ladies, so that in itself to me is a fascinating story. Another interesting thing about Hawaii, when George Patton was there, he was very observant. He noticed, George Marshall noticed the same thing. The Japanese ships would come into the port at Pearl Harbor. The officers would get off the ships and they would ostensibly go to visit their relatives who lived in shacks by the pineapple fields. George Marshall and George Patton said this would never happen because in Japan there was such a caste system, and these two would never mingle. So George Patton felt like Japan was preparing war with the United States and had plans on attacking Pearl Harbor. George Marshall came up with the same theory. They reported their inclinations and theories to the powers that be, but this was unheeded. But I thought that was an interesting aspect. Of course, on December the 7th, 1941 was the day that would live in infamy, and the 3 generals here were prepared. The country may not have been, but these 3 generals were. Marshall was in Washington. He was considered to be indispensable, and Roosevelt depended on him a great deal. George Patton went to North Africa, and MacArthur went to the Philippines. One interesting thing about MacArthur, when he was sent to the Philippines, he boarded a ship, and that was his passage to the Philippines. And while he was on board, he met a young lady from Murfreesboro, Tennessee, Jean Fairclough. And they fell in love, and they were married, and she went to live with him in the Philippines. And they had one son. Anne Worthing from Tupelo says her grandmother was best friends with Jean Fairclough. So I thought that was interesting. George Patton served in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy, and he was in charge while the tank warfare, and we could not have won those battles without him. But of course it was in Italy where they had the infamous slapping incident. George Patton just snapped, I suppose. He was visiting a hospital, and there was a young soldier there who was suffering from post-distress syndrome, that's what we call it now, and he slapped him. Eisenhower was furious with him, as was George Marshall, but they came to the conclusion that they could not win this war without Patton. So they protected him, and the reporters there agreed not to mention this, but Drew Pearson did not go along with that. So he wrote the expose, and all H-E-double-M for a clue. So anyway, Patton had to recover from that, but his military friends felt he was too invaluable to lose. MacArthur, of course, was in the Philippines when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and their next target was the Philippines. General MacArthur had every intention of staying there and fighting, but he was too valuable, and they wanted him to be the commander of the forces in the Pacific. George Marshall told Roosevelt that MacArthur will not leave unless he gets a presidential order from you. And that is what Roosevelt did, because they desperately needed MacArthur's talents. And of course, the eloquent MacArthur said before he left, I always had a little flair for the dramatic. He said, "I shall return." And so that is gone in as one of the famous quotes in history. On March 21st, Douglas MacArthur, his wife Jean, and their son boarded a T-boat, and they made, in the dead of night, they made a harrowing journey to Australia. And it's rather miraculous that they survived that journey. Well, let's go to Overlord. We're at D-Day now. I'm skipping a lot. But George Marshall had been waiting all of his life for a command such as this. But he was in Washington. Roosevelt was so dependent on George Marshall. His genius was just amazing. It really was. He's a marvelous tactician. But anyway, Roosevelt asked him, who would you appoint, or what do you want us to do? And Marshall, ever gracious, very patriotic, said, "President Roosevelt, it's your decision." Roosevelt said, "I have to have you here in Washington." And so Eisenhower became the commander of the D-Day invasion. Patton was a real force in France during World War II, and without Patton, of course, we probably never would have won the Battle of the Bulge. He was very much a force in that, and atomic warfare proved to be what helped to win it. So it's a good thing Marshall and Eisenhower came to his aid. One funny thing about Patton, which there's a wonderful speech in here, but I cannot read it because it is so laced with profanity. And I would not do that to you. But this is funny. This is, they're in the Battle of the Bulge, and the weather was beastly. It was terrible. And he called for the chaplain. And he said, "Chaplain, I'm tired of these soldiers having to fight mud and floods as well as Germans." Patton said, "I want you to publish your prayer for good weather." And the chaplain said, "Sir, it's going to take a pretty thick rug for that kind of praying." And Patton said, "I don't care if it takes a flying carpet. I want the praying done." "Yes, sir," said the chaplain. "May I say, General, that it usually isn't customary among men of my profession to pray for clear weather to kill our fellow men." "Chaplain," Patton frowned, "are you trying to teach me theology? Or are you chaplain of the Third Army? I want a prayer." "Yes, sir," the chaplain replied. So he came up with a prayer. "Almighty and most merciful Father, we humbly beseech thee of thy great goodness to restrain these immoderate rains with which we have had to contend. Grant us fair weather for battle. Graciously hearken to us as soldiers who call upon thee, that armed with thy power we may advance from victory to victory, and crush the opposition and wickedness of our enemies, and establish thy justice among men and nations. Amen." The day after the prayer was issued, the weather turned crystal clear and remained that way for a week. Patton was exuberant and called in one of his aides. And he said, he uttered a profanity, but he said, "Look at that weather. That was some potent rain. Get that chaplain up here. I want to pin a medal on him." Patton's headquarters at that point was in the process of moving, but the chaplain was duly produced, and Patton awarded him with the Bronze Star. "You're the most popular man in this headquarters," Patton told him, shaking his hand. you stand in good with the Lord. So, you know, that is typical Patton. In the Pacific, MacArthur eventually did return to the Philippines, and when Japan surrendered, he was on the deck of the USS Missouri, and he was the supreme commander of all the Allied powers, and he was there when they signed the document. And then, as he signed the document, he gave a pen to General Wainwright and to General Percival, who had both been in Japanese prisoners of war camp. And of course, General Wainwright stayed there on the Philippines when MacArthur left. So anyway, that was a touching moment. After the war, just real quick, George Marshall was the founder of the Marshall Plan. Both George Marshall and Winston Churchill felt like the Treaty of Versailles after World War I was too punitive, too vindictive, and they felt like the reparations that Germany had to pay were unfair, and that eventually this would lead to another world war. And of course, that was very prophetic. That is what happened. George Marshall openly spoke out for a plan to help those who were defeated, and both he and Churchill felt like in victory you should be magnanimous. So after World War II, Marshall came up with the Marshall Plan. Truman, who was president then, had advisors who wanted it to be called the Truman Plan. President Truman said it would never pass through Congress with all the Republicans there with his name attached to it. He said, call it the Marshall Plan. It was called the Marshall Plan. George Marshall received the Nobel Peace Prize. He also became chairman of the American Battle Monuments Commission. He went to Queen Elizabeth's coronation, and he was a hero in Europe. And when he and General Omar Bradley walked into Queen Elizabeth's coronation, everyone there stood up. And George Marshall asked Bradley, why are they standing? And he said, they were standing for George Marshall. So that's how well he was thought of in Europe. George Patton came home a hero. He chose to stay in the Army, and he was sent back to Germany. Before he left, he told his two daughters that he would not see them again. He felt like he had this clairvoyant experience again. As it turned out, one daughter woke up one night. She heard the telephone ring, and it was a transatlantic telephone call, and it was her father. And he asked how she was, and then they lost connection. The other daughter woke up in her room, and she saw her father on a bench in her room. The two daughters called each other the next morning, and they said, Dad is dead. It's essentially what they... So he had predicted his demise. George Patton is buried in Luxembourg with his men. That was his wish. As it turned out, MacArthur was with the Army of Occupation in the Pacific and in Japan. He was sort of a benevolent dictator when he was in Japan, but the Japanese people came to admire him a great deal. While he was there, he gave women the right to vote, and he did away with worship of the emperor, and he did away with the secret police. So for those three reasons, he was popular with the Japanese people. But unfortunately, Douglas MacArthur, of course, as I said, had this imperious demeanor. He thought he knew what was best when it came to the problems with Korea and China, and he sort of maybe overstepped his bounds. Truman did not really get along with MacArthur that well, and he didn't like Eisenhower either. But anyway, Truman could use a few profane words also. But anyway, he fired General Douglas MacArthur. But Douglas MacArthur came home a hero in spite of this. He landed in San Francisco. There were throngs of people there cheering him on. And when he landed in Washington, Omar Bradley was there to greet him, George Marshall, and all of these prestigious military military people. I'm going to end with the two speeches by MacArthur because they are the most eloquent. And of all the three generals, I think he was the most eloquent. I think George Marshall was the most virtuous, perhaps the genius of the group. And of course, George Patton was the most flamboyant and most fascinating of the three. But I'm going to end with George Marshall's speeches. When he was fired, he came back and he spoke to the combined halls of Congress, and it was a packed house, and I'm sure Truman was furious. I would have been. But anyway, Douglas MacArthur gave this stirring speech, and he ended with this. I'll end with it. He ended with this speech, in this part of his speech. Perhaps the most stirring words ever spoken in the halls of Congress. When I joined the Army, it was the fulfillment of all my boyish hopes and dreams. The world has turned over several times since I took the oath at the plane at West Point, and the hopes and dreams have long since vanished. But I still remember the refrain of one of the most popular ballads of the day, which proclaimed most proudly that old soldiers never die, they just fade away. An old soldier who tried to do his duty as God gave him the light to see that duty. And then when MacArthur was 82, he went to West Point to receive the Sylvanus Thayer Award. And this was another speech that has gone down in history. From your ranks come the great captains who hold the nation's destiny in their hands the moment the war tocsin sounds. The long gray line has never failed us. Were you to do so, a million ghosts in olive drab and brown khaki and blue and gray would rise from their white crosses, thundering those magic words, duty, honor, country. The soldier, above all people, prays for peace, for he must suffer and bear the deepest wounds and scars of war. But always in our ears ring the ominous words of Plato, only the dead have seen the end of war. The shadows are lengthening for me. The twilight is here. I listen, then but with thirsty ear, for the witching melody of faint bugles blowing reveille, of far drums beating the long roll. In my dreams, I hear again the crash of guns, the rattle of musketry, the strange mournful mutter of the battlefield. But in the evening of my memory, I come back to West Point. Always there echoes and re-echoes. Duty, honor, country. Today marks my final roll call with you. But I want you to know that when I cross the river, my last conscious thoughts will be of the Corps, the Corps, the Corps. And I bid you farewell.
Thank you, Margaret, for that. That was very entertaining and informative. Do you want to have time for questions, or are there any questions? Dr. Dan?
Hey, did Winston Groom mention MacArthur and the Japanese Constitution? My understanding is that, well, he was in charge of Japan, he basically determined the framework of the Japanese government by helping write and overseeing the writing of the Japanese Constitution, which is still in effect.
Yes, I think that's true. I know Mike has read that. He had a lot to do with changing Japan into what it is today.
When MacArthur was the commander-in-chief of the occupied Japan, he shared an office building with Gene Murphy. The medical clinic was in the dialysis building where MacArthur's headquarters were. And once or twice he rode in the elevator with them.
Oh, no, super. That was two great men together. Yes, two great men together. And you know,
Did General Marshall become Secretary of Defense under?
he did. George Marshall became Secretary of Defense. And he was, like I said, he was just such a virtuous person, and you could not help but admire him. We could not have won the war without him. And Roosevelt really depended on George Marshall. But anyway, Winston Groom's done a good job, I think, with writing this book. And the bibliography is great. So you can keep reading if you get snowed in anything.